In this video, I want to explain what a ground is, and then we're going to compare what an oil ground and what gesso is. The ground is the way in which you prepare your painting surface so it's ready for painting. There are three major components that go into the ground layers of a painting. You have the surface, which is the thing you're going to paint on. Then there's what's known as sizing. The sizing is a glue that forms a protective coat over the surface, as well as it provides a stiffening agent, particularly when it comes to canvas. Then finally you have the actual ground layer, and that is the prime layer that's used to protect and preserve the surface, as well as give you an opaque layer to paint on top of. Okay, so acrylic gesso is a water-based polymer dispersion ground, meaning it's a ground prep layer that's constructed out of a polymer medium and then a combination of pigments and extender pigments or fillers to create a white, opaque painting layer for us to work off of. Being that it's a water-based product, it's very fast drying, and even though you can get a layer of gesso to dry in say like 20-30 minutes, it's still a good idea to at least wait a day before you put another layer on. The reason is you don't want water to get trapped in between the layers of your gesso and then have paint go on top of that, because eventually that water is going to try and mitigate out the surface and it will try and delaminate your paintings. Evaporation specifics aside, it's still a very good product for painting surface. It bonds really well to oil paint. It also enables people to produce a process that's kind of like the old Renaissance egg tempera to oil process. You can do an acrylic ground, work acrylic underlayers, and then work into oil painting over top of it. The jury on whether that's 100% sound practice is still a little bit out, but it's relatively safe to consider it okay at this point. As I mentioned before, there's a convenience factor with an acrylic gesso as well, because it serves as both the sizing as well as the ground layer for painting. So you can bypass the need to put a sizing onto a surface if you use multiple coats of gesso. Public service announcement for artist material snobs like myself. I've been using the term gesso quite interchangeably with acrylic gesso. This is merely because this has been co-opted as a commercial term for acrylic polymer dispersion grounds. It actually does a disservice to traditional gesso, which is the real gesso, consisting of a hide glue as well as chalk and opaque white pigments. It was used traditionally in egg tempera painting and then was also used as a ground for some oil paintings. It's a very beautiful surface to paint on, and people who think that gesso is acrylic gesso make traditional gesso users very mad. So the natural benefits for acrylic gesso are they're pretty obvious, because it creates a lot of convenience in the painting world. I can create surfaces with relative ease. I don't have to have a lot of products, and things are relatively fast drying, so I can put lots of layers on and get to the painting surface that I want to use fairly quickly. A simple way to think of an oil ground is to consider it a very lean white oil paint that also has a chalk or filler component in it to increase its absorbency. And oil grounds differ from acrylic gesso in that the process is more separated. You have your painting surface that you're going to work on, then you apply a sizing to that surface to protect the fibers of that painting surface, and then you apply an oil ground over top of the sizing. So it's not an all-in-one product. Painting on an oil ground also requires that you have to wait a longer period of time between ground layers, as well as when the actual painting surface is fully prepared. So if I was to make my own painting surface with an oil ground, I'm going to construct or acquire my surface, then I'm going to apply a sizing to it. I personally use rabbit skin glue, but there are lots of polymer options as well. After that has dried over the course of a day or two, I will then apply oil ground, and it typically will be the first coat goes down, and then I'm gonna have to wait about a week for it to fully cure, and then the second coat will go down and the same thing happens. I usually have to wait about a week or so before it gets cured enough, and then I will sometimes apply a third ground, or I will sometimes go into that second ground with my actual painting. So it takes more time to create it. Now that I know what these two products are, I have a better understanding of what I'm choosing. Before I get totally into that, if you're getting value out of this, maybe share this with a painter friend of yours that you think could benefit from this. And if you've tried these two surfaces, leave a comment. Let me know what your favorite of the two is. It would seem like it's a no-brainer that you should just go with the gesso. Although there is an expediency factor with acrylic gesso, I have personally found that when I paint on an oil ground, the flow of the paint is better. I've actually noticed a lot less sinking in on my paintings when I prepare an oil ground versus an acrylic gesso ground. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, the painting surface seems more responsive to me. I just feel like I have a better connection with it. And the way in which I would probably equate that is one of the principles that guides my overarching painting practice is the concept that like dissolves like. That if I was going to mix products together or try and combine things in the service of making a painting, if I can make them more like each other than not, then they will be more compatible during my process. In the case of an oil ground for an oil painting using oil paints, the fact that it's all using linseed oil, it just feels and acts more compatible in my painting process. I don't necessarily have to fight an acrylic gesso ground, but it just feels like the paint moves easier in the ways that I move it when I use an oil ground. I'm going to make a bold assumption that it's likely you've painted on an acrylic gesso surface before. If you haven't tried an oil ground yet, it's worth a try.